Hey everyone, how's it going? If you remember from previously when I did the Terminal Directive card series, this is basically a continuation of that, except without the Terminal Directive part. For those of you who just joined us, this is basically a series in which in each episode we will pick a new card, theory craft it, deck build with it, play a game with the deck, and then do a theoretical review of the card after the fact. So this is basically a souped up version of a pack review except with individual cards. This series will be called Successful Demonstration. Successful Demo for short. So yeah, if you remember a week back or so, I posted a video asking for suggestions on the name that this series should be called, and there was a lot of you gave very good suggestions, and I can't take all of them obviously, but I love all of them. I am a boring person myself, for those of you who don't know me personally, and I really like Circle Master's suggestion of just calling it examining the card, whatever the card name is. I think having it being easily searchable is a huge plus, and yeah, I really wanted to go with it, but well, after seeing this one get so many upvotes, I guess democracy wins the day, and this series will therefore be called Successful Demonstration. So congratulations to Fantanizer. Well done on picking such a good name. Here, have a virtual cookie for all your efforts. Also makes sense because the card art depicts a graph that rises with time. So hopefully I'll get more views with this series. We'll find out in time to come. But for now, let's hop into our very first episode where we feature a card from Blood and Water. This is Waroid Tracker. So this is an upgrade, a HP upgrade, and at first glance, numbers look incredibly similar to a card that we've already seen, and a card that's actually going to rotate out, Ash. So they are both two res cost upgrades. They're both two influence from the HB faction, and they both trigger on a trace 4. So the similarities are there, and trash cost is almost the same. That's just a slight difference. Warroid costs 4 to trash, Ash costs 3. They're also the Waroid subtype. So yeah, they're very similar, but basically the similarities end there. Their functionalities differ rather greatly. Let's look at this in detail. Ash protects the cards in the same server by preventing access for those other cards in the server. So therefore, Ash is a good agenda protector. Waroid Tracker, on the other hand, does not protect agendas. Instead, Waroid Tracker triggers when the runner trashes cards in the server. So it doesn't trigger on agendas, but it triggers on assets and upgrades in the same server. And the punishment for the runner is that they must trash 2 of their installed cards instead of, not being able to access. So instead of being an agenda protector, Waroid Tracker is an asset or upgrade protector. This is an important distinction that is the fundamental reason why these two cards are so different in functionality. Finally, one small little difference. Ash is unique. Waroid Tracker is not. Of course, when we talk about cards being unique, the first thing that pops to your mind is obviously Rumor Mill, the kitty that ruins Ash but will not ruin Waroid Tracker. However, there's actually something a lot more subtle than this, and a lot more important, I should say. Waroid Tracker synergizes with itself. You can stack multiple Waroid Trackers in the same server, and once you get 2 or 3 in the same server, they all trigger off each other. So this is actually a really nasty interaction that causes Waroid Tracker to be super powerful. So when you're deck building with Waroid Tracker, you want to have these things in your deck. You need to have a high threat asset or upgrade to defend. When I say high threat, I mean something that the runner needs to respond to, something the runner must trash, otherwise the court will gain a huge advantage. So if you have that threat on the board, Waroid Tracker makes it super expensive to trash a threat, and that's exactly what you want. It's basically a souped up encryption protocol. You also want to abuse the synergy with stacked Warroids, as I mentioned earlier. If you have 3 Waroid Trackers installed and they try to contest one of them, they will have to suffer the traces from all 3 Waroid Trashers. That's right. They have to trace 4, trace 4, trace 4 when they trash one Waroid Tracker if there are 3 res in the same server. That is oppressive as hell. So if you want to double down on the oppressiveness, you've got to play 3 copies of Friends in High Places. Finally, unlike Ash, this doesn't require ice stack on the same server. as naked Ash undefended is pretty useless. The runner will simply trash the Ash. The power of Ash comes with the multiplier effect it has on the server. If the runner is not willing to pay the Ash trace, they have to run the server twice. Once to trash the Ash, the second time to access whatever's in the remote. Waroid Tracker does not work that way. Waroid does not gain a multiplier from running the server, because the runner can simply trash as many or as few cards as they want to on that run. What Waroid does, however, is to have a multiplier effect on itself, and as well as whatever assets or upgrades you jam on it. So ice are not required. Basically, from all these deck building objectives, I think you can probably tell what sort of deck best suits Waroid Tracker, or rather abuses Waroid Tracker the best. And that's none other than some sort of prison deck that strives to put Waroid Tracker in the same server as a political asset, your clone suffrage movement, your commercial bankers group, your Sensi Actors Union. This will form an incredibly oppressive asset spam deck where the runner simply cannot compete with these high impact political assets, and allow the corp to just run away with the game with massive draw or credit engines, or being able to recur biotics and friends and stuff. So obviously the most optimal way, in my opinion, to use Waroid Tracker is in such an oppressive, negative player experience asset spam deck. Yeah, this is not really the kind of deck we want to play for the very first episode of Successful Demo. So instead of doing that sort of oppressive stuff, let's go with something more fun. Let's play NBN Making News. So in Making News, we are still trying to build a good deck, don't get me wrong. With NBN Making News' 2 recurring credits, you can spend them on Waroid Tracker's traces to make them, just a bit more powerful. And here we are not abusing Waroid Tracker with asset spam, we are only using it for one and only one purpose, to protect Sensen City Grids. Sensen is my idea of a threat. A card that the runner must deal with. They have to trash the unrest Sensen, otherwise you threaten scores. You threaten breaking users, you threaten scoring 3-2s, fast advancing them, and as with CTM decks that we saw in the Flashpoint heyday, we have the exchange of information combo as well. So this is our objective with the deck, to protect Sensen City Grid with Waroid Tracker, and then fast advance agendas. Against Clot, this will not be possible. Against Aaron Marin, you won't be able to get exchange off, but fear not, because Making News has other users. With our Ice Suite, it's super taxing and isn't too expensive to res, except for Toll Booth, which will do the heavy lifting for slowing down the runner. These ice will allow us to jam agendas in the remote and get away with scoring agendas, even as the runner watches us carefully. So yeah, a dual fast advanced glacier deck. It's kind of like Jammy HB but in yellow. We'll see how this performs. Let's head into the game. Oh yes, before I forget, one more thing. My opponent is also running new cards. In fact, they're going one pack ahead of me by playing this card called Blue Moose from Free Mars, which is the fifth data pack this cycle. So this is a 4-cost neutral resource on the runner side that allows them to gain 2 credits at the start of their turn each turn if they exile a card from their bin. Because the data pack has not been officially released, Blue Moose will appear as a blank card on jinteki.net, so be sure to keep that in mind while we are watching this game. Today we are up against Valencia, which is normally an unwinnable matchup, but because my opponent doesn't run blackmails, they're just using Valencia for the bad publicity, as in, 1 free credit per run. Well, it's not so bad. Let's see how things go. I'm going to secure both centrals because I'm not sure if my opponent's on account siphon or not. Well, if you start with 3 ice, might as well do so. You'll notice that I saved the toll booth because I really want it for the remote. I suspect that I'm going to lose in the long haul, so I need the toll booth remote to jam as many agendas as I can before my opponent sets up their entire rig. Once my opponent has their entire rig up, there's no reason for me to win the game, unless I'm already on match point and I can threaten. Yeah, Anox have very good late games nowadays, and you don't want to contest the late game against them. However, I'm forced to play slowly for the first couple of turns because I need to get in restructure range. Thankfully, my opponent doesn't play aggressively. Even though they rebirth into Edward Kim, they did not run my HQ, so I'm not forced to rest the HQ ice. So now that I'm on 15 credits, I can start thinking about jamming my agendas. Project Build is not really an agenda I want to score early, so I'm holding off a bit for now. The most important thing here is to actually ice up HQ because I do not want my opponent gaining access into HQ. Usually the first thing that Edward Kim does is run HQ over R&D because there tends to be important operations in HQ. So I need to secure that from my opponent. Meanwhile, my opponent sets up Data Sucker and Desperado, and this is not as good as Temujin, but it's basically about as good. So at this point, I'm basically forced to ice archives. I do not want my opponent getting free Sucker tokens while gaining credits at the same time. So a pop-up window isn't enough because my opponent has a bad publicity from Valencia, meaning that running through archives costs nothing. So I needed something bulkier, which is why I put the IP block on archives. My opponent hits R&D here instead of HQ is quite interesting, but I think they'll be hitting HQ instead if I did not put the second ice on HQ. So by diverting them to R&D, I give them a pretty hard hit in Archangel, which fires, and I get to bounce something. Obviously, I don't bounce it's between Desperado and Data Sucker. I chose Data Sucker there because I did not want my opponent to threaten my toll booth on the remote with Parasite and Data Sucker, because it seems like that is what my opponent's going for by farming Sucker tokens. So I needed to rest the toll booth there to defend it, and sure enough, my opponent drops the Parasite on my toll booth remote. Not happy about that. So I quickly score the build before my opponent can get any chance of getting in. I don't know if they have a Yong in hand right now, but if they do, I need to make sure that my agenda is evacuated by the time they get in. This puts me in what seems to be a weak position with only 4 credits. However, I know that my ice is very easy, cheap to res. This is one of the big benefits of playing NBN Semi-Glacier. IP block is only 2 to res, and the pop-up window on HQ is only 0 to res. So I'm not worried about being on rather low credit level. My opponent installs a blue moose, and this is where the economy starts spiraling out of control. They try poking HQ thinking I'm poor, but they are not going to get much out of it. I knew this would eventually happen, but since I didn't draw agendas early on, I could afford to bleed a couple of HQ accesses, knowing that I can rest the sync BRE that is behind the pop-up later on. Now, I find the second Waroid Tracker and it immediately goes to my remote, no question. Here is one of the very interesting interactions that you have with against Anarchs and Waroid Tracker. Waroid Tracker triggers not only on trash assets upgrades in the server, but also on ice protecting the server. So when my opponent tried to run my toll booth to trash it with Data Sucker and Ice Carver, I res both Waroid Trackers, which bankrupts me, but if they decide to go ahead and suck my toll booth down, they are the ones that are destroying my toll booth, and as a result, they are going to suffer both Waroid Tracker traces. They are going to have a trace 4 and a trace 4 to their face, and because I'm making news, I can pump these up by 2. This means that my opponent will be forced to trash 2 of their installed cards, and they really don't want to be trashing their Sucker, their Desperado, their Ice Carver, their Blue Moose. So this is going to be a really difficult decision for them here. Do they go on with the toll booth trash? They decide to. 8 credits for an 8 res ice is too much to give up on, so I do get to fire the Waroid Tracker, and what I do is to distribute the making news credits amongst both Waroid Trackers. Each one gets a trace 5, and my opponent shouldn't be able to beat both. They are just 1 credit short of beating both actually. They are Edward Kim, which gives them 1 link. However, they needed 8 credits to beat both. So what happened was that my opponent was forced to trash 2 of their installed cards. They chose to trash Data Sucker and Ice Carver, instead choosing to preserve their economy in Blue Moose and Desperado. Alright, so yep, that was a very, very expensive run for my opponent, and worked out very well for me. They obviously couldn't afford to contest the rest of the server, so both Waroid Trackers remain in the event that I want to jam more items into that remote. It also means that future ice on that remote are much less likely to be targeted down with Parasite, because my opponent would have to trace through both Waroid Trackers again. So yes, Waroid Tracker is amazing against Anarch. Oh my gosh, against Ice Destruction, you have so much protection against Parasites and Cutlery. Especially when you begin stacking the Waroid Trackers, it becomes really unreasonable. No one wants to trash 2 of their installed cards, and the traces are not trivially beaten when you're up against making news. Now, I bait my opponent into running this remote when all that's in it is Jackson Howard. I'm forcing my opponent to spend big money here by putting the trace 5 on the IP block. My opponent's forced to spend 3 real credits and 1 bad pub to get through it, only to see the Jackson Howard. And normally Edward Kim would trash the Jackson Howard here, having 13 credits, but they can't. They can't, because if they do, they will have to eat both Waroid Tracker Tracers, which is way unreasonable. So as a result, I get a guaranteed Jackson Howard on my next turn, and I get to double draw, and last click, I'm flooded with agendas, so I'm thinking of drawing here. The question is, do I draw 1 or 2 cards? I decided to draw 1 card because I was going to pitch 3 agendas and I didn't want to pitch any other useful cards. So food, Bill go in the bin, and I shuffle them immediately. Given my opponent's influence spread, they're spent on Desperado and Rebirth and Parasite from what I've seen, so Rumor Mill is incredibly unlikely. That being said, I don't want this to be a wash of a game just because I neglected to use the Jackson Howard, and they had the Rumor Mill on the off chance, so I simply shuffled them back in. Not that big of a deal anyway, but yeah, so you see how amazing it is when you play like Jammy NBN with jamming Jacksons in the remote. Not only do they waste tempo contesting the remote, they can't even contest the Jackson Howard when most other decks in most other corp decks they normally could. However, that being said, we are settling in for the long game, and this is detrimental for me because my opponent's actually getting 2 credits off Blue Moose every single turn. This is going to be really rough. This is very powerful economy, and as a result, my opponent's never poor. As you notice, that credit pool is always in the double digits, and this means that there's no safe scoring window for me. I'm forced to actually show up my centrals first and foremost because my opponent's placing a lot of central pressure. As you see here, they are hammering archives with Temujin and getting through IP block rather trivially with a combination of paperclip and data suckers. As a result, I'm forced to actually show up archives. You don't really want to dedicate a piece of ice as big as Archangel on archives when your opponent's not Omar or doesn't have Sneak Door, but in this case with a Temujin directed there, I think it's perfectly fair. So my opponent attempts to get their Temujin money again, and I'm going to disappoint them with a very expensive Archangel. They can't afford to trace through this because I'll just bounce their Temujin or their paperclip. Probably not the Temujin, maybe the Blue Moose. Either way, they paid through the nose for a Black Orchestra, but they're still pretty rich. Between Temujin and Blue Moose, they still have double-digit credit, so this is really annoying. One of the strengths of NBN making news is the ability to tax the runner out significantly with your ice, but this is not happening right here. Even though I am taxing out my opponent, they are making credits way faster than I am sapping them from the credits, so this is really, really problematic. Here, because of my awkward credit level, I was forced to discard the pop-up when I actually wanted to install it on R&D because I knew that the Archangel would be under threat very, very soon. I couldn't do that because that would put me on 7 credits and I couldn't IPO that turn. So now my opponent has access to R&D, and to get the suckers they need to suck down my Archangel, they're first going to run HQ. I finally get the chance to rest my Sync Bree, and this allows me to slap some tags on them. So what Sync BRE is a 6-strength sentry. No one ever wants to break a 6-strength sentry, so the tracers almost always fire. The tracers are typically rather insignificant, especially when your opponent has Rebirth into Kim. That turn 1 Rebirth was so huge against my deck, because the one link has saved my opponent so many trace credits over the course of the entire game. Should I even bother counting? There are so many. That link is doing a lot of work against making news. But I still get to use my making news credits, so my opponent didn't get to access cards from hand, and I'm not sure if they took the tag, but either way, it was very expensive for them. And it was rather futile HQ run, but they did get the suckers they needed to hammer down the Archangel on R&D. And this is really bad news because I'm very, very confident that there's a medium somewhere in my opponent's deck, and it's going to come down soon. So with no other ice drawn, I was forced to dedicate the toll booth to R&D. What I really wanted was to put the toll booth on the remote. That would be the perfect remote ice because my opponent would be disincentivized to run through the toll booth multiple times if I keep jamming agendas, which I have a lot in my hand right now. Moreover, it's very important to note that they can't simply just destroy my ice, the toll booth that I'm going to put on my remote, because that will incur them 2 Waroid Tracker Tracers. Instead, I'm forced to put the toll booth on my R&D to defend against the ice destruction. And this is not optimal. You know for a fact that my opponent will not simply run through the toll booth every single time to get medium runs. What they will do is drop a parasite on it, and I have no defense for that. I can't move my Waroid Trackers to R&D much as I'd like to. So at this point, I'm treading water. I'm trying to disincentivize my opponent from dropping a parasite on my toll booth and running R&D to just... Oh, too late. Yep, they found it. Yep, there it is. So this is why I needed to preemptively re-ice R&D. At least force them to pay extra if they want to contest my toll booth. But yeah, with my toll booth gone now, that's me sunk in terms of economy. All my opponent needed to pay was 2 credits to destroy my 8 credit toll booth. That was not acceptable, and I'm starting to become really flooded here. Thankfully, I have a second Eli, which helps keep things at bay for now. But double Eli is definitely not ideal server, especially with my opponent making 2 free credits a turn with Blue Moose. They can easily run through this R&D again and again, and now they're progenitor medium setup. So this is where my scoring window closes and where the Anarch runner gains advantage. You never want to go to a game this late against Anarchs, and if you do, you must be on match point. Clearly, at this point, I'm not on match point. Far from it. In fact, I stand a very little chance of winning by this point. And this is what happens when you drag out the game. As you see from the chat bar, we are on turn 18 right now. Blue Moose has triggered enough times to gain my opponent at least 20 odd credits. And you can't compete with that kind of economy. You just can't. You need to be pumping out agendas fast and furious in the early game, which I couldn't, because one big reason was that I did not have Sansan City Grid available to me. One amazing move I could have made was to install Advance on the Sansan, the breaking news, score it, and then exchange for the food that is now in my opponent's score area. That would be a big move that would swing tempo heavily in my favor. I wasn't able to do that because even though I ran 3 copies of Sansan in this deck, I didn't see a single one. Not yet. They are all in the bottom 19 cards. So right now, I'm just waiting for the Sansan to appear. If the Sansan appears, I can dump it in the remote and force my opponent to check it. Or run through my IP block, trash my Sansan, and contest both Waroid Tracers. That is my game plan right now, to sap my opponent's tempo by spamming Sansan City Grids in the server. This is the kind of threat that I need, but I'm not getting it. Instead, my opponent has the freedom to run through my R&D for pretty cheap, and I'm forced to defend with suboptimal eyes such as Turnpike. My opponent's tag, but they can easily remove the tag and drop a parasite on the Turnpike for good measure. Finally, a great piece of ice. This is why I put a Macrophage in this deck. Macrophage synergizes very well with NBN Making News. You get the 2 trace credits to use, and it helps with one of these really weak matchups, virus-based Anarch. Trouble is, my opponents saw the Macrophage as well, so they know full well it's coming soon. I couldn't install it this turn much as I wanted to because my economy was so languishing. So I had to wait next turn, in the meantime bleeding a lot of accesses to my opponent. There's a little upshot to this. Most of my agendas are not in my deck anymore. There are 3 in the score area, and there are actually 3 in my hand, now down to 2 because I sneakily pitched a food into the bin. So with that, there are actually only 4 agendas remaining in the 17 card R&D. Still a sizable number, but by no means the best server to run. In fact, the HQ density, agenda density is higher. My opponent gets a guaranteed agenda in archives, so yeah, R&D is not actually the most palatable server right now, although having the medium gives a lot of impetus for my opponent to hammer R&D. But you bet that the Macrophage is going on R&D to defend against that nasty medium. It also helps that my opponent is constantly using Edward Kim to hammer operations out of my R&D. I saw interns and now restructure in the bin. These are cards I really could be using right now, and it only accelerates my opponent's R&D digging, which does not help my case. So I'm looking at my opponent's bin, and I'm seeing a lot of cards exiled from the game with Blue Moose. They are really making so much money with that card. The Sansan finally comes, but I can't drop it just yet. I need to click for credits so that I can threaten the Macrophage on R&D. They know that this is a Macrophage, so you bet they'll prepare for this scenario. Also, if I saw a Sansan earlier, a play that I was considering to make was install Advanced Breaking News, score it, and then trash the Blue Moose. This is how big Blue Moose is to my opponent's economy engine. If I'm able to disable that, they would have so much less economy to repeatedly run R&D with. And contesting a rare Sansan is actually a lot harder than you think, because it's protected by double Waroid Tracker. So yeah, I wish I could show that to you, but I can't because, well, Too bad. That's not happening here. Because I didn't draw the Sand Sands early enough. Yeah, contesting a Blue Moose would have been so good. Alright, so my opponent, yeah, plays Inject and dumps a bunch of stuff in the bin. Thankfully, Nerf Agent hits the bin, because if my opponent got to install Nerf Agent here and repeatedly hit HQ, it's completely game for me. So here I dropped the sensor in the remote, but I did see that my opponent used an inject to inject a slums earlier. You can rewind the video to watch that in action, but yes, I knew there was a slums in my opponent's hand. That was why I was checking my opponent's bin and the exile area. There were no slums inside, so I kind of knew that my opponent was holding the slums in their hand for this moment. Now they get to drop the slums and run the remote, and this is one thing that Waroid Tracker suffers against. Slums is a hard counter. Due to the same logic as CTM, if you use slums, the slums a card in the same server as Waroid Tracker, Waroid does not trigger. This also includes using slums to remove Waroid Tracker from the game. So yeah, this is an important rule to note. This means that slums is definitely a very hard counter to Waroid Tracker. Still, my opponent had to pay 2 credits for the IP block and 5 for the Sand just to remove it from the game, so it works out in my favor. I'm slowly sapping tempo away from my opponent, and there's still 2 more Sand left somewhere in the deck. My opponent runs Archives for Temujin money and fetches the food that I sneakily trashed there. This should give them the hint that there are a lot of agendas in hand, and that HQ is the place to hammer. But with Nerf Agent in the bin, they can't really do that. Thank goodness. However, there is a Parasite ticking down on R&D, and it's about to die very soon. My opponent clicks for credits here, and I draw yet into another agenda. Wow. So yeah, while my opponent wasn't checking R&D, while they were taking credits, I started drawing all the agendas, the breaking news, the Astro script. Now I'm completely flooded, and doing a quick count. 4 agendas in hand, 4 in the score areas. There are 2 agendas remaining in the 13 card R&D. So at this point, R&D really is the least worrying server at this point. My bigger issue is I don't see any way I can win this game. My economy is too poor. I only have 8 credits. What can I do with 8 credits? Not much. I can't build a 3 deep remote to win the game. So this is actually really bad for me. Unless I draw my Sand Sands in quick succession and jam them into a remote, I'll need to find another way to win this. I'm thinking right now, the best way to win is to find myself a second piece of ice that's suitably taxing, something like an Archangel, not too expensive to res. There we go. IP block is a suitable piece of ice. I put it on the remote along with the Sand Sand that I drew that turn, forcing my opponent to run that remote. They know that they have to contest the Sand Sand, otherwise agendas are coming out from my hand onto the table. So they ran it, and faced with the double IP block, they paid 2 credits per IP block to reach the Sand Sand at the bottom. Double Waroid Tracker would fire, but again, my opponent simply slums the Sand Sand. But that's fine. I'm slowly sapping tempo away from my opponent, and that puts them down to 3 credits. And because of this, they can't contest the Macrophage R&D this turn. I mandatory draw into the Jackson and immediately slam the Astro onto the table. This one is really a 50-50 mind game. It could have been the Jackson I just drew, it could have been the Astro that was sitting in my hand the whole time. I chose the Astro, and as my opponent started deliberating over their turn, I started regretting. This seems like a very obvious move, to jam an agenda right after your opponent checked the Sand Sand the last time. This screams agenda, and if my opponent finds the Astro here, they would put themselves on match point, making it very hard for me to win this game. If I were my opponent, I'd be checking that remote every single turn, you bet. But it's gonna cost my opponent a lot of credits this time. Instead of paying 4 for the ice, they have to pay 6 because they're out of sucker tokens. So instead, they click for credits and target R&D instead, thinking that with multi-access from medium, they're gonna stand a better chance on R&D. That was their mistake, because with that, I'm able to fire off my making news trace and force them to pay 4 for the second trace, which is trash a virus. I was gonna trash the medium if they decided to let it fire. They couldn't afford that, therefore I got the traces off. Macrophage is incredibly taxing for this kind of Anarch virus deck, and without Cipher, they do not have a good way of getting through Macrophage at all, repeatedly. So yeah, my opponent was only seeing very limited cards from R&D. My R&D was well defended. In the meantime, I sneaked the Astro out, and suddenly, because of this one Astro script, I am now in the driver's seat. I threaten the win next turn by scoring a build from hand. Alternatively, if my opponent somehow snipes the build from hand, I have a second win route. Breaking news into exchange of information. At this point, there is no way for my opponent to win unless they fetch the 2 of 3 agendas in my hand. My opponent's running the wrong server now, they're running archives. This is one less click they have to contest my agendas. They need to get the agendas now, they need to win this turn. Their two options are either to multi-access R&D and hit 2 agendas to win. That would be the project build and the global food remaining in R&D. Or they somehow find a way to get past my HQ twice and steal both 2 of 3 agendas from my hand. This is looking very unlikely for my opponent. Let's see if they can make this play work. What do you think is their best play? They decide to drop MK Ultra from their hand and then run HQ. With MK Ultra, they thought they could contest the Sync BRE, but Sync BRE is a monster. 6 strength. With 2 sucker counters, they bring it down to 4 strength. That's not enough for MK Ultra. MK Ultra only deals with strength 3 sentries with 1 boost, and my opponent was 1 credit short of boosting it a second time. So they were not able to break Sync BRE as a result. I allowed my opponent to take this back because clearly they miscalculated. So what they would do instead is to pretend that they took a credit for their 3rd click and then rerun. This will allow them to have 3 credits to break the Sync BRE, and they access an exchange of information. Kim didn't trigger because they accessed archives before. But even if they were able to get the Kim trigger off my exchange, I would have simply fast advanced the project build in my hand instead to win on 7 agenda points. Alright, before we talk about Waroid Tracker, looking at the game statistics, because this game was a long drawn out game, both of us drew down to less than double digit cards in the deck. It lasted 27 turns, so these numbers are very inflated. We see that Making News drove a huge profit, but no profit larger than Blue Moose, which single-handedly, with 1 install and 4 credits of down payment, made a profit of 36 whole credits. My opponent exiled 18 cards from the bin to do so. That is ridiculous. That is absolutely nuts. That's more than 2 Temujins. Nasty, nasty economy. So yeah, I think if there's one thing you want to learn besides Waroid Tracker is that once Blue Moose hits your meta, you need to have fast corp decks because untrashable Sundew on the runner side is really, really good. Now, Waroid Tracker itself, we knew before coming into this game that it would be oppressive when stacked with itself. Remember that time when my opponent decided to trash Toll Booth and had to suffer 1 Waroid Tracker fire? They had to trash their Data Sucker and the Ice Carver. That losing of Ice Carver cost them the game because if they had the Ice Carver around, they would be able to run through Eli's and IP blocks for 2 credits without needing Data Sucker tokens, and that actually made the difference because they lost quite a few credits due to not having Ice Carver around. So yeah, double Waroid Tracker is an amazing server to have, especially when they're trying to parasite down your toll booths. We also knew that Waroid Tracker would be good at protecting Sand Sands, in fact so effective that my opponent was forced to install the Southside Slumps from the hand. What we didn't realize, and what we learned during the game as we went along, is that Waroid Tracker has an additional bonus versus Parasite decks because it triggers on Parasite trashes. It also is blanked by Slums. Slums is such a hard counter to Waroid Tracker. While Waroid Tracker can still deal with Ice Destruction, you can't do the Sand trick that you normally do. They just slums your Sand and make the Waroid Trackers sit there look like they are useless. So yeah, great to have these playthroughs because we wouldn't have realized these fun interactions with Waroid Tracker that we wouldn't have learned otherwise just by theory crafting. Now, some of you might be saying, wow, that's an interesting semi-glacier Making News deck. I want to copy this deck. I want to play this deck for myself. But can I ask you, do you think Waroid Tracker is better or is Ash better in this semi-glacier Making News deck? Well, it really depends on your meta. And I often give this answer. It doesn't mean that I don't really know what I'm saying, but it means that you need to know what you're up against. Waroid Tracker is less good than Ash if you are clock locked. If you cannot fast advance off Sand is no longer a threat. Therefore, runners with clock lock can simply ignore your Waroid Trackers, they can ignore your Sand, they can choose not to trash anything in your remote. They just have to check the remote to make sure that you're not pumping out agendas. This makes Waroid Tracker a lot worse because they're basically ignored. Similarly, Waroid Tracker is worse against Slums. It doesn't fire when the Trace 4 doesn't fire when your opponent has Slums, compared to Ash, where Ash fires when even when they have Slums. Conversely, Ash doesn't fire when the runner has Rumor Mill. Waroid Tracker does. So yeah, it really depends on your meta. If you're expecting anti-fast advance, Ash is better. If you're expecting Caprice and Ash hate in the form of Rumor Mill, I think Waroid Tracker is a better choice. Yeah, and obviously Waroid Tracker works better if you have an Anarch meta with lots of ice destruction. You can be flexible with where you place a Waroid Tracker. It doesn't have to be on the remote. You can put it on R&D to stop your toll booths on R&D from getting trashed, and that's really good as well. So all these things are worth keeping in mind when you decide to build your deck and decide which 2 influence purple upgrade you want to play. I wouldn't play one of each because Waroid Tracker is really so much better when you stack it with itself. Finally, just an interesting note to make. If you are thinking of improving this deck by saying, hey, Waroid Tracker seems okay, it seemed to do some work in the game that you just played, but I could do better. Maybe I could play more, say, assets or more upgrades that force the runner to trash. Things like Mumbai Virtual Tour, or maybe some asset-based economy like Launch Campaign. Well, the more you dig into this rabbit hole, the further you will go into asset spam hell. Because as I mentioned to as I alluded to at the very start of this video, honestly, the best way to play Waroid Trackers in asset spam, and the more assets and upgrades you put in, the more you realize this, that the best deck that you can make is probably one that goes more horizontal than vertical. If you love asset spam, go for it. Otherwise, I would say, hold yourself back, restrain yourself a bit, and just be content with a deck like this, because it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole of asset spam hell, and you'll have a much less enjoyable deck for some. Well, hopefully that wasn't too grim of an ending note. Waroid Tracker is still a pretty fun card to run, unless it's too powerful. It really is a very powerful card in asset spam, not gonna lie. But it's pretty reasonable in a vertical deck like this, where there's not that much that Waroid Tracker synergizes with. That's the conclusion. Thanks everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully we'll see more of this series in the future. Till next time, happy night running. Goodbye.